Hey everybody, I'm going to talk about the US-China trade war today. More specifically, how Google has restricted updates to phones manufactured by Huawei, which is the second largest phone manufacturer in the world, and how it's related to the trade war, and how China also has how China has a point of leverage on us via interest rates and treasuries. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And it is going to be pretty interesting, so take a listen. So let's talk about the current situation with Huawei and Google. If you do not know, Huawei is the world's second largest smartphone manufacturer, and they are actually ahead of Apple in terms of smartphone sales, and they are right behind Samsung. And who is Huawei? They are a Chinese company, so they manufacture phones and I believe probably tablets. I think they do a lot beyond just phones. But one of their main things that they do is phone sales, and they run most of their phones or all of their phones on which operating system? The Android operating system. However, I woke up this morning on May 20th, 2019 to find that Huawei's use of Android has been restricted by Google. So I read a tweet yesterday that Google was revoking their licensing. And I was like, no way. If that happens, this is huge. Right? And the initial reports were actually more catastrophic sounding. And this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. Because if the number 2 smartphone maker in the world has their ability to use Android restricted, I mean, that's a blow, man. That is a big blow, even if it's not it's not a kill shot, and I don't know how crippling it is, but it's going to make things tougher for the company, I would assume. Then again, I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but let's take a look a little bit. I like this article from the BBC because it's not so alarmist. So let me run through a little bit about this. It says, Google has barred the world's second biggest smartphone maker, Huawei, from some updates to the Android operating system, dealing a blow to the Chinese company. So we see some of you guys are going to read headlines about how they're not allowed to use it, but that's not the case. It's just basically restricting new and upcoming updates. It says new designs of Huawei smartphones are set to lose access to some Google apps. That move comes after the Trump administration added Huawei to a list of companies that American firms cannot trade with unless they have a license. Google said it was complying with the order and reviewing the implications. Huawei said it would continue to provide security updates and after-sales services to all existing Huawei and Honor smartphone and tablet products, covering those that have been sold or are still in stock globally. So, it says when Google launches the next version of Android later this year, it may not be available on Huawei devices. So there's a lot of keys here, guys. It may not be available on Huawei devices. Future Huawei devices may no longer have apps such as YouTube and Maps. Now, for people in China, that's not a big deal. They're not allowed to watch YouTube anyway. But, for obviously this is a global manufacturing brand, so that is a problem if they can't get access to that. But basically, this is just restricting the use of the operating system. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden the Huawei phones are going to go blank, because that's what I thought at first. When I first read headlines, I was like, oh my God, are we about to see a shutdown of millions upon millions or billions of phones across the world? Are we about to see a huge, is everyone just about to get cut off from Android? I thought that was going to be insane. But no, it doesn't look like that. Basically, it's just going to make it more difficult for people using Huawei phones. So maybe they'll be missing certain apps, like it says YouTube or Maps, and they won't be getting certain updates with the new updates coming out. And over time, that will be a big problem. But of course, in the short term, it's not an emergency. It is an emergency, but it's not, right? It's an emergency because the technology moves so quickly that you're going to need to get those updates ASAP, but it's not an emergency as in the phones are going to go blank tomorrow. It also says here the UK mobile trade body, Mobile UK, said it was working closely with relevant authorities to understand the implications of the US Department of Commerce's placement of Huawei on its entity list. Last Wednesday, the Trump administration added Huawei to its entity list, which bans the company from acquiring technology from US firms without government approval. So, also Huawei's chief executive, Ren Zhengfei, told Japanese media on Saturday that we have already been preparing for this. So, I don't know what that means. I don't know if anybody knows exactly what that means. But this is an escalation in the trade war, right? And basically, something that I believe we're going to see over the coming weeks and months is we're going to see, until something comes to more of a head on this, we're going to see weird stuff like this pop up. For example, I don't think anyone knew this was a possible scenario. I didn't. I had no idea that this was a possible option. That basically, to me, what this is signaling to the Chinese is that, look, we have a lot more control over what's happening than you think. We just haven't been exercising that. And it looks to me like the Trump administration is basically saying, look, we've got all these levers. We're going to start pulling some of them, and we're going to see what shakes out. And it looks like we are now pressuring the Chinese really, really hard. So this is from the BBC article titled, Huawei's use of Android restricted by Google. Good article. I would recommend checking it out. It's just straight. It's not a bunch of BS. So then I went over to the Verge here, and it says in one of their articles titled, what is it called here? Huawei response to Android ban. The first response is to promise that existing Huawei and Honor phones will keep receiving security updates. So I'm not exactly sure how that works, but basically Huawei is going to try to make sure that their devices maintain some type of security updates. I don't exactly know how that's done, but whatever it is, that's what they're promising. It says Huawei has made, this is a quote from Huawei, Huawei has made substantial contributions to the development and growth of Android around the world, and as one of Android's key global partners, we have worked closely with their open source platform to develop an ecosystem that has benefited both users and the industry. Huawei will continue to provide security updates, blah, blah, blah. It says they'll continue to basically stay dedicated to building, to making the ecosystem better. So it says, for its part, Huawei has been making preparations for an eventuality of losing access to the software from U.S. companies like Google and Microsoft, and it has been developing an in-house operating system alternative to Android. That may be what the company hints at in the final paragraph of the statement when it says it will continue to build a safe and sustainable software ecosystem. So this is interesting development. We know that Android is the software used in in all smartphones except for Apple, pretty much, and a few Microsoft or Blackberries. And so it's a really big deal that the second largest smartphone maker in the world is now going to get restricted access to Android updates. That's a really big deal. It's a bigger deal than I think people realize. Like I said, it's not a death blow, but it's a problem. It will be very interesting to see if they do come out with their own operating system. What's also interesting here is that I'm not making a prediction, but we could see here what they call a balkanizing effect, where we start to see even more so in China. So in China, they have mainland China, people are not allowed to use YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, I'm sure some other stuff as well. Twitter, that's heavily used in non-Chinese countries. Well, I guess Western countries and even Asian countries. So I could see this going a step further and basically the situation happening where, okay, the Chinese now have another operating system and they start using that, rolling that out for their smartphones. But, while that may they may be able to pull that off in China, it's going to be interesting to see if they do come out with another software platform. How will that interact with existing software systems? How will that interact with existing phones that are still going to be on Android and the iOS system? It will just be interesting to see. I mean, who knows? Maybe they basically have an exact copy of Android and they're just going to roll it out. I don't know. I mean, I'm not that tech savvy, just slightly, just enough to mess up my computer when I want to. Now, so that is what has been going on the U.S. side. Now I'm going to jump to an article from Peter Schiff talking about treasuries. So if you guys could hold on for a second, going to do some ads here, then we'll get right back. Hey everybody, this ad is about a podcast called A Little About a Lot podcast. I have not seen it, so take it at your own risk. A Little About a Lot is a variety show by YouTubers. Kelsey and Becky behind the channel The Sorry Girls. Kelsey and Becky spill tea about their personal lives, talk about the struggles of relationships and dating. Becky is married and Kelsey is not. Oh my. Research their favorite celebs from the 90s, answer audience questions, interview some badass people, and more. We want to challenge perspectives and leave our audience feeling refreshed, inspired, and with a little more knowledge about a lot. Search your podcast app for A Little About a Lot podcast and subscribe to the A Little About a Lot podcast. And that is it for this. Okay, guys, so now I want to jump over to a post written by Peter Schiff, who is a financier of types. He does a lot of gold and silver sales. He's very financially literate, though his predictions have not been paying off recently. He does think that there will eventually be a U.S. dollar crisis, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about is the other part of this trade war. So what do we know what's going on? In the mainstream media, we know about tariffs, right? We know about import and export taxes. We know that the U.S. is raising imports on certain types of goods coming into the U.S. from China. What is that supposed to do? That's supposed to increase the cost of those goods for U.S. consumers, so that way we are more inclined to buy domestic or other countries' goods. So that should theoretically, that will decrease the amount of things we're buying from China, which will have a negative effect on the Chinese economy, especially as they're so heavily dependent on manufacturing. Now, if we hit them with these tariffs, right, it could hurt them. I mean, it's going to hurt the U.S. too, because it's higher prices for us to buy things. But it can also hurt the Chinese a lot. Now, with this thing with Google and Android, it looks like that's another play. I would not have ever thought of that. Obviously, I don't know everything that's going on, but that's a big deal. It's almost like demonstrating to China, we have more power than you think. Now, let's go take another angle. What can the Chinese do? Well, one thing we forget is that the Chinese own a lot of U.S. debt. So let's take a look here. I'm about halfway through this article by Peter Schiff. It says China sells most U.S. treasuries in 2.5 years amid threats of nuclear option. China remains, this is partway through the article, China remains the biggest U.S. creditor. Even a pause in Chinese bond purchases could become problematic for the U.S. as it dumps billions of dollars of treasuries on the market in order to fund ballooning deficits. The U.S. federal government ran an all-time record deficit of $234 billion in February. Even as the Chinese are shredding U.S. treasuries, they are buying gold. China added gold to its reserves for the 5th straight month in April and appears to be accelerating its purchases. So what happens if the Chinese sell U.S. treasuries? So treasuries are how the U.S. government can borrow money. They essentially issue a bond, and somebody buys the bond, gives the U.S. government money, and the U.S. government says that we will pay you back, we'll pay the bond back with interest over time. So essentially, it's like, it's just borrowing. Now, there's interest rates attached to those. And from my understanding, I do have a degree in economics. And what I do remember, and from the research I've done post my degree, that the price and the interest rate are inversely correlated. So the higher the price of the bonds, the lower the interest rate. The lower the price of the bond, the higher the price of the interest rate, or the higher the interest rate. Now, the idea here is that if China, who owns what is it? They own like over $1 trillion of U.S. debt. And it says, but if that $1.11 trillion in treasury holdings does give the Chinese significant leverage. Yeah, so the Chinese own a little over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. So the idea is that if they wanted to, they could sell off that debt, right? And if they bounce back and forth between them and some other countries, and they own one of the biggest amounts of U.S. debt. So what they could do is if they sold off enough of that, they could lower the price of the bond and increase the interest rates. What does that mean, though? If they increase the interest rates, it means that the government will have to pay a higher amount of money for people that are lending it money. Now, you might go, well, what the fuck does that mean, Taylor? Who cares? It means that the government's expenditures will go towards paying interest instead of providing services. So if the government is if our government is spending, however many $1 trillion a year, or I don't know what the budget deficit is. I don't know exactly what the budget is. But the idea is that as interest rates go up, the government will have to spend more money paying interest, which means it will have less money for military. It will have less money for Social Security. It will have less money for all of the welfare programs that we have because more money will go towards paying the debt. That is a possible existential problem for the United States. That is a vulnerable spot for us. But Peter Schiff goes on. He says, most analysts think that this is bluster because the Chinese are threatening this. They're threatening to sell U.S. treasuries, which would increase interest rates, which would basically devastate. If they did it aggressively enough, it could really cause problems to the U.S. economy because then basically a lot of the subsidies that we're engaged in just wouldn't be fundable. You just wouldn't be able to pay for many of the things that we're currently running through the government. It says it would, while a major Chinese dump of U.S. treasuries would wreak havoc on the U.S. economy, it would also create problems for China. A fire sale on treasuries would cut into Chinese reserves and potentially destabilize the yuan. Then again, China wouldn't have to sell everything to have a huge impact on U.S. interest rates. Even dumping a relatively small amount of its holdings would push up rates, and the debt-fueled U.S. economy has very little tolerance for higher interest rates. So that is that's a big problem potentially. And it's just, I really wanted to talk about it because basically this trade war is ramping up, and everybody should buckle your seatbelts because this is interesting, right? You got the Chinese selling treasuries, you got the U.S. restricting Android updates to Chinese phones, Chinese manufactured phones. I mean, who would have thought? Who knows what's going to happen next, right? Are the Chinese going to start shutting down factories that manufacture Apple products? Like this, who the hell knows what's going to happen? But anyway, just to give you an idea, this is a very nuanced situation that's happening between the U.S. and China. And I don't know if I've never seen anything like this. Then again, I'm not that old, so there you go. That's all I got for today. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.